Thank you so much for allowing us to record this session. It's really very important. We have had students request for the recorded video, and that is always very good to share with the students that ask to watch it later. So at this point, I would like to really welcome you to this session. We have one of our own, Dr. Jason Baker. Jason is a professor in the College of Education in the College of Education, actually, and Human Services, but within the psychology department. He is the coordinator for the School of Counseling program in the university. He has taught in the psychology department for 14 years. Dr. Baker's research and service interest seeks to promote the use of evidence-based interventions to reach the needs of all school students through comprehensive school counseling programs and systemic influences. So at this point, I would like to welcome Dr. Baker to talk to us. Welcome, Dr. Baker.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that kind introduction. And for all of you that are here with me, thank you too. It's good to see you all, those who are sharing your cameras and those who aren't. It's good to have you with us too. We can feel our energy here, hopefully across this platform. So I want to make sure my screen is sharing here correctly. I'm going to bounce this out now to the slides. So I'm just looking for a bit of feedback there to make sure that you're seeing my screen now with the slide in front of you. Okay, I think we have it there. So again, my name is Jason Baker, and I'm Associate Professor of Psychology and the coordinator of our MED school counseling program. I've titled this lecture, and I really appreciate the invitation to be able to come here. I've titled this lecture, I and I, Self, Spirit, and the Road to Resilience. I think there's much to be said in our times, especially now, as we kind of confront challenges that we never had imagined we would have to confront even a year ago. Focus on self that we maybe never had the chance to reflect on a year ago, and a consideration of some of the elements of spirit and how our resilience connects with this spirit and takes us forward, hopefully, into the new decade with renewed energy and renewed opportunity. So I'm hoping that as I go through this presentation, you find moments of inspiration that take you places into your own self and into your social contextual situations around you, so that you can find new opportunities for growth too. That's kind of the big frame of what I'm here to talk about today. So I just want to give you a brief overview. First, I want to look at examining resilience and spirit and what that means exactly. Then I want to talk about a couple of theories in psychology that might help us understand some of these trying times, including Adlerian theory, Jungian theory, and complexity theory. And then I want to look at some specific constructs from these theories that might be useful. And then I want to make some direct applications from those constructs to the practice of promoting resilience of spirit. I suspect that many of you here are here not to hear necessarily background theories in the field of psychology, though I'm sure some of you are interested in that. But I'm suspecting that many of you are here because you want to think about ways to promote resilience and spiritual development in your own lives. And that's what I want to try to ensure that we receive some of that near the end of the presentation. And then at the end, I have some discussion and philosophical considerations that I would like us to consider together. Let's start with examining resilience and spirit. I have here a word cloud that I'm hoping we might be able to participate in. I'm hoping this QR code is active. So if you've never seen these QR codes before, what you should be able to do is take your phone here or device and open this with your camera. And it should then take you to a site. It should open up your browser and take you to a site where you can enter in these different words. So I'm asking here two different things. The first is, what three words come to mind when you think of resilience? What three words come to mind when you think of resilience? And we'll do that one first, because when you go into the word cloud application there, you'll see that one first. So I'm just making you a little bigger on my screen so I can see some of you to ensure that this might be working. Do I have any confirmation that you've been able to open this and see this? Okay,
Yes.
good. Is it working, Melissa?
Mhm.
Excellent. And you're seeing the resilience piece first?
My app, yes.
Excellent.
hmm
So take just a moment and do that, and then we'll see what kind of words come to mind here.
Oh, so you're connected to this Mentimeter.
Yeah, so what we're seeing here is, I'm going to show you this. Let's see if we can make this work, the magic of technology here. What we're seeing here is an active collection of the words that you've been entering.
Okay.
And as you keep entering them, they'll grow in size. So it serves kind of as a way of representing the frequency of the words that have been submitted.
Okay.
I didn't want to show it to you at the beginning because there's that thing in psychology that we have to watch called mental set. And sometimes we see what we see once we've seen it, if that makes sense. Originality is born out of not seeing, maybe. Okay, so I'm seeing strength and determination, perseverance, adaptability, overcome, challenge, comeback. Flexibility, grit is an interesting one. We've seen that the construct of grit gain a lot of attention in the educational literature, especially over the past couple of years. Okay, flexibility, determination, good. Adaptation, focus, belief. Excellent. We'll talk about some of these concepts too as we go through our conversation here together. But it's interesting that strong and strength, at least from my view, seem to be the biggest words there on our word cloud. So there's something to this strengthening of self and strengthening of spirit and strengthening of opportunity that seems to be overarching, I think, when we think of the concept of resilience. Okay, and then what I want to do is I want to try to move us to the second one. Hopefully what you're seeing there is now, through that same QR code, the chance to enter 3 words that come to mind when you think spirit. You might have to refresh your browser there. I think it changes once I change the presentation slide, so hopefully it's there for you now. Ooh, there we go. Zeitgeist, unconscious, mindset. Yeah, guide, hope, autonomy, freedom, love, faith, aura, peace, free, within. I like that. Give just another couple of seconds for those of you who might still be entering words there. Yeah, interestingly, at the heart of this, though, I see the word heart and faith and soul and hope, reflection. Enthusiasm, that's an interesting one too. The motivation that takes us into these places, maybe of heart and faith and soul. Okay, good. Well, thank you for participating in that. What that does, of course, is it helps us frame our conversation here in some ways to see this information kind of hopefully shared out in what we're talking about in this broader conversation. I want to stop the share and come back to my PowerPoint here now. Okay, so those words, as we see them, hopefully give us some idea of how we are stitching together the different components of this lecture. I called it I and I because I and I has that, to me, that deep meaning of kind of connecting what we are as an individual with what we are, our contexts outside, and bringing some of what we have outside of us into us. For some, that's a God, that's a deity, that's a spirituality, a theistic element. And for others, it's just recognizing that there's something out there beyond us that we can bring into ourselves and that we can connect with in a very important way that helps us advance not only who we are, but potentially who others are and how we connect with those others around us. So I want to dive into some of the theories here that I've laid out, 3 psychological theories in particular, that I think can help guide us in some ways. And some of you may be familiar with these, but I tried to pick some of the theories that are maybe a little more obscure that you maybe haven't heard about in a basic introduction to psychology class. Those are Adlerian theory, Jungian theory, and then complexity theory. So let's start with Adlerian theory. Alfred Adler was a contemporary of Freud, did a lot of work at the same time as Freud, but he also had a lot of different motivational elements to his theory. And like Freud, he thought that much of what we see as personality development later in life is born out of those early years of our lives, those formative years. So he had a really strong focus, much like Freud and many other thinkers at the time, of the childhood experiences and how these childhood experiences perpetuate and propagate a future personality and, in his mind, lifestyle in our future lives. So his word here was lifestyle. So he talked about encouragement and talked about this idea that we have encouragement that connects us in cooperative ways. And through encouragement, we're able to make these inroads into one another. And by doing so, we build community and we build cooperation and we build what he called social interest. Social interest then bridges this kinship with others and establishes a sense of belonging. This idea of belonging is a really important concept in Adlerian psychology. This sense of belonging is transformative. And I want you to just think for a moment in those times when you were able to sit in a situation where you knew you belonged. How powerful is that? When you know that you're surrounded by a community, a context, something that helps you understand that you belong there. We actually see now some research showing that one of the important elements of students staying and retention and staying at a university or staying in a particular class is often predicated on this sense of belonging, this feeling like we actually belong there. And to some of us, it might seem really abstract, but it's kind of one of those concepts that we know it when we're in it, and we can certainly feel it when it's around us. And the challenge here, of course, one of the reasons I wanted to include Adlerian theory is because I think his ideas paint a really broad picture of what it is that we can see as the things that individuals need to be successful and feel grounded and feel connected in their communities. And it just currently happens to sit juxtaposed to what we're not getting, many of us, in our communities, in our contexts, and in our cultures right now. Through this last year, we've been put into these trials of wondering what it means to feel like we belong in a Zoom meeting. And maybe that seems a little different than the way we might have felt like we belonged in a social space where we were actually breathing the same air. So lifestyle, he noted, was predicted by early childhood experiences. And again, that kind of being a predicate to personality and some of the elements that we then manifest throughout the rest of our lives as far as personality elements. And then beliefs, they convey important components of self-concept. Beliefs are very important, and some of you connected these beliefs to these spiritual elements. So how our beliefs guide us and transport us in these times of trial, and how we are buoyed by these resilient elements and the beliefs that we hold is something that I want to spend more time with as we go through the next couple of slides in particular. Okay, so some of us might be familiar with Jungian theory a little bit too, at least probably an understanding of who Carl Jung was as a person maybe. And this one you're more maybe likely to experience in some earlier classes, but he talked about the collective unconscious. That is that we get these inherited elements that kind of come down through our evolutionary and psychic evolutionary trees that form a common basis for human experience. And for many, that common basis for human experience that Jung talked about provided an opportunity to to connect with others in ways that are primordial and that are very depthful, that go beyond what we're just experiencing in the moment. Because we do have these kind of shared histories and common ancestral archetypes. That brings us to archetypes. This, for him, provided latent mythology and imagery that undergird memes of human understanding. Of course, now we see the word memes, perpetuated through many of our online and social media streams. But the word meme, of course, was originally coined by Richard Dawkins in his writings of the late parts of the 20th century, talking about the selfish gene in particular. But these ideas that we have memes that are perpetuated, these elements of cultural transmission that can be perpetuated through our understanding of one another is profound and deep, and it goes deeper into Jungian psychology here as we consider archetypes. One of the really interesting topics I think that Jung talked about, or constructs that he promoted in his theory, is that of synchronicity. And synchronicity, here's the big definition of it, and then I'll see if I can give some examples so we can reduce it down to something practical. Synchronicity can describe coincident acausal events that bridge conscious experience with elements of collective unconsciousness. So for some, these are coincident events that we might just see as coincidental in our objective realities. So when you bump into somebody on the street and you have this kind of moment that like you just, had a feeling that there was something deeper there, that you coincidentally bumped into them at the same time when you were considering something else in your life, and that person might offer you some opportunity because of that seemingly coincidental connection, that could be described as Jungian synchronicity. He broke it down into different ways that we see subjective and objective experiences. So for many of us who love to dream, record our dreams and appreciate what our dreams send us and tell us in our sleeping moments, Jung tapped into that very well too. So he connected the subjective to the objective. So I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you've had a prescient dream or a lucid dream or a dream that's taken you to some place that then you find that your objective state of reality is affected by that in the next day, in the next week, or the next months maybe. That would be, to Jung, this element of synchronicity. Again, I just want to give some background here. So this is the theoretical piece, and then I want to get into some of the more applied pieces. So I don't want to go too far off the rails here in giving you terms to use and apply. But as we're going through some of these terms, hopefully you're thinking about ways that you can make applications to your own lives and your own elements of resilience that maybe you've witnessed over the past year, or maybe even longer as we think about the longer tail of our lives. I have here chaos theory, and chaos theory is sometimes melded with complexity theory. Complexity theory is becoming a theory that is very multidisciplinary. It's being applied to many different systems level thinking elements that exist in many different disciplines. But I included here a couple of different important elements and constructs from chaos theory, because I think too, these can be helpful in helping us consider our own resilient nature. So here's some basic assumptions. We're talking about complex adaptive entities, and these could be anything from human beings to trees to educational institutions to systems in communities. These complex adaptive entities are wide-ranging, and we can look at them from different angles by applying some elements of these of this theory. So they're affected by what chaos theorists call sensitive dependence on initial conditions. So it matters how we start, and that sensitive dependence on those initial conditions can give rise to many different kind of deeper elements as we go through life. Think about the sensitive dependence that we had last March, maybe when we first heard about this influence of COVID and what it was going to do to our lives. We were sensitively dependent. That is, we were sitting in a moment where we recognized that the thin membrane that held us to the world around us was vibrating in ways that we weren't sure the full implications of. And in fact, the waves of those vibrations are still being felt, I think, even now, a year out. And few of us maybe would have thought that that would have been the case maybe a year ago. Entities are also affected by what's called autopoiesis. That is self-renewal. And the great part about applying chaos theory and complexity theory to the human condition, I think, is, at least to me, is that it's very inspirational. We engage in self-renewal all the time. We're growing new cells, we're growing new hair, we're growing new thoughts, we're growing new ideas. we're manifesting new opportunities through the renewal that we create as a complex adaptive entity. And that autopoiesis of self-renewal is something very important. We can't, unfortunately, like the starfish, regrow a missing limb. Of course, it's not that robust in us, that self-renewal process. But the ways that we can change our mind and change our brains and change the way we think about things and understand things and apprehend them, I think is something that really puts us very high on that tree of the animal kingdom. Entities contain self-similarity at scale. Maybe you've heard of this too before. We have fractals. So fractals kind of exist at different levels. At lower levels, we can see self-similarity. So if you zoom into the grains of sand on the beach, you might be able to see similar patterns that exist when you zoom out at larger levels. And that's what fractals essentially are. But these entities contain them too, and we are, again, one of these entities. So we'll talk about ways that we can maybe make connections to that too. Open systems experience phase transitions to seek fitness peaks, which might yield the greatest chance of survival. Because again, we as human beings are open systems. We seek these phase transitions. We seek fitness peaks around phase transitions. And again, this is a year, I think, where we've experienced many phase transitions. Things that we thought we held on to that were important pillars of our lives maybe a year ago may have changed. But hopefully we found, as we've maybe been swept downstream a little bit and moved to change our view of the river or ocean around us, we may have found greater fitness peaks. We may have found new opportunities to explore something different in self. And those open systems, we recognize that that's a flow that might affect them. Attractors influence the ebb and flow of energy. We'll talk about those a little bit too. We have things like torus attractors, point attractors, other attractors. Again, I don't want to go too far and deep into this. We could spend the rest of the time talking about some of these elements, but I just want to introduce them to you here so we can maybe come back to them and find direct connections as we go. The butterfly effect, maybe we've heard of. The more complex a system, the more likely a small perturbance is to have large periphery effects. And there's no doubt that our systems now in our modern world are, well, arguably more complex than they've ever been. Look at the things that are happening in the IT world and how, broad systemic changes and systemic impacts that can come from any number of different directions have sometimes broad impacts on the overall functioning of the system. But they could even be just small perturbances. That's the butterfly effect, and it goes back to the work of Conrad Lorenz. Okay, so what specific constructs might be useful here, coming back to our overview? I want to include a couple that come from Aristotle. Maybe we've heard of some of these before too. But again, in finding our roots here, this I and I come back to this idea of how we find our roots in times of opportunity and change, and how we connect that to the world around us, to our broader goals, to our development, to who we are becoming. One of them is telos. This is a term that Aristotle wrote about in Nicomachean Ethics. And telos, in the way it's often translated, is kind of an end, goal, or purpose. And for Aristotle, there was a uniquely human element here that included rational thought, that we as individuals, unlike trees and other complex adaptive entities, we have this rational thought that we're able to engage in so we can advance our own understanding of the world around us in recognizing our goals and our purpose. Many of us probably have 5-year plans to accomplish goals. You're here at the university for reasons that help you actualize goals in your own life. You have an end, you have a purpose that you might recognize. And that telos within us is very important. I included the tree here too, and I've made some references to trees already. Trees, if you think about the acorn is a very powerful symbol of opportunity, because in that acorn, if given the right support, the right sustenance, the right contextual environmental experiences, becomes this amazing oak tree that goes beyond what many might have thought it could have been at that small level. And we, like oak trees, I think, when we find firm roots, recognize that the biggest, broadest side of us is often farther reaching than we might have ever thought possible at other times in our smaller lives. The other Aristotelian term that I wanted to include here is entelechy. Entelechy is the idea or condition or thing whose essence is fully realized or actualized. In some ways too, I've seen this translated as kind of a good indwelling spirit. There's something in us. There's a vital form that directs us and directs us towards self-fulfillment. So not only do we have a telos, that is that we have a goal or purpose in mind as we go throughout our lives, but we have hopefully this entelechy, this thing that's realizing and actualizing us as we go. So I included here a couple of video clips because I know these terms can be probably fairly abstract, but here is a growing seed, a time-lapse seed that might show us telos and entelechy in a more natural way. Okay, I think that's the part where the advertisements come in. All the rest of the videos that I show are actually my videos. This one I did include from YouTube there because I didn't have the mechanism to make these time-lapse videos of a seed growing. But hopefully you appreciate as we see this seed grow, the telos and the entelechy that Aristotle was writing about so many centuries ago. Here we see overcoming these challenges, these seeds kind of growing to something much deeper than, or much broader than, again, we might have ever thought possible. But within that seed, again, we see the opportunity for growth. Another one that I want to talk about here is emergence. This was a term that was first coined by Lewis in 1875. And emergence also is an interesting property of a system that allows for growth that happens externally, that comes from it. Here's the complicated definition, and then maybe we can get some applied examples here. A system exhibits emergence when there are coherent emergence at the macro level that dynamically arise from the interactions between the parts at the micro level. Such emergence are novel with respect to the individual parts of the system. So in psychology and brain science, one of the most interesting probably elements that we explore as an emergent element is that of consciousness. Consciousness emerges from emerges at the macro level from these interactions between parts at the micro level that we will probably struggle to understand for at least the near future, if not into our long-term future as human beings. It's a complex problem to understand that idea of consciousness. But I think the idea of emergence is very powerful because we see it in all of these different ways in these complex systems around us, including in ourselves. And I just want to show you a couple of video clips that might help us understand emergence in ways too. And as I'm doing this, remember, we're coming back to the human spirit and the self here as we're considering this. I love including these videos of nature because we have really good research that demonstrates that immersing ourselves in nature allows for a lot of developmental elements of self to come forth. This one's my video. Let's see if it comes through. Okay, one last time. I'll click it again. Okay, so there we see all these emergent elements, from the breaking surf of the waves to the blowing granules of sand to the reaching stretch of the water coming in and higher up in different times on the sandy surf. Lots to think about there. Here I drew a line because I was, at the time when I was sitting on this particular beach, I was listening to a lecture about emergence, and I figured this would be a great time to draw a line in the sand and just see what happens and record this. So we'll talk about the implications of this after we see it. So how often have we drawn lines in the sand, metaphorically in our own lives, and seen them change, seen them be overcome by forces that maybe we didn't recognize, or we didn't fully appreciate, or we had to stand and behold after watching the way the system unfolded. And of course, this line in the sand, it might have survived those couple of waves, but the waves of the future there are surely to take it away. And that's okay. And recognizing that that's okay kind of grounds us in that philosophical understanding that we are part of something bigger. And at least to me, that's where some of these spiritual elements come in, as we recognize that while we might draw lines in the sand and they might be very important for particular moments, they're not with us forever. And that's an important, I think, reflection on how we see changes. But the good news is, as we see those changes, wow, how beautiful is it that the surf comes in on that line that was probably never meant to be squared off that way anyway. Here's an interesting quote that gets a little deeper into this science of emergence and adds some other elements here. But we manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors within boundaries. So we set up systems here and recognize that we're trying to manage them. A lot of, again, this complexity theory applied to the modern world has us thinking not about building like little Lego pieces from a reductionistic elementary level, these complex systems, but rather allowing them to emerge into these complex adaptive entities that come from macro level elements that emerge from these micro level interactions. Okay, so we've been very, very theoretical up to this point. I want to add some elements here that are hopefully a little less theoretical and maybe a little more applied. And then I think this will transition us into a conversation, hopefully, that we can have that will add some of your thoughts to this as well. So I went back here and grabbed some of these different terms that I talked about, and I tried to put them into some practical implications for the resilience of spirit that might come from them. So let's look first at autopoiesis. If autopoiesis is this kind of renewal, this self-renewal that we have, this self-generative element of ourselves, how do we look for that? How do we find it? I think sometimes just recording those things in our lives that are autopoietic, that have this element of self-generative self-renewal, this growth that we can witness, that helps us appreciate the larger aspect of who we are as an individual. Even though sometimes we might feel like we take one step forward and two steps back, or two steps forward and one step back, I think it's recognizing that there's a self-generative mechanism that is helping us march forward. And that self-generative mechanism is within us in so many different ways. Again, from our thoughts to our emotions, to our fingernails growing, to any number of other different cellular structures that we recognize as being autopoietic in our own lives. How about phase transitions? I put implications here. As we experience phase transitions, we probably all remember maybe those basic science experiments we might have done when we were really young. You know, and you take water and you turn it into ice and you turn it back into water again, and then you make it steam and float away. Those phase transitions too, similarly, we experience in our own lives. And we recognize that there are times of stable functionality when maybe we're a solid ice cube and we're there for the moment in that freezing space, recognizing that there's no threat to us becoming something else. And then we also recognize that we have these chaotic transitions. Things change us. And the things that change us might melt us down and turn us back into that flowing water that we once were, or might even heat us up to the point where we steam away and float off into something different. But the idea here is that we're recognizing and appreciating phase transitions. I know some of this might sound a little maybe abstract, and I recognize that putting this in a chart and saying, just appreciate your phase transition from one thing to another is much easier said than done, especially in this kind of academic way versus the applied way. Losing a job, seeing your family change, losing somebody who's very important in your life, those can be phase transitions that have long-term impacts. And trauma is real. But recognizing that phase transitions are a natural part of life, I think, helps us in some ways, hopefully, go with the flow, if that's not an overused phrase yet. I also included here self-similarity at scale. So one way of doing this, and I'm noting here that most of the things that I'm putting in these implications for the resilience of spirit are cognitive, or they're rationally applied. So kind of almost like the extension of Aristotle's telos. They don't have to be rationally applied. They can be experiential, they can be affectively applied, and we're going to get into that with with the attractors piece there in the last part of this slide. But what I'm saying here in many ways is a cognitive or rational application of this. So we look for micro elements in self, and we consider how these elements might be present at higher levels. What parts of us do we see as micro elements that are important, that might scale up, that we can see at higher levels? Many of us might see some of our elements of self cast out into our social environments. And that's in fact maybe how we build culture and community and the values within us. As we become leaders and we become promoters of those values in those around us, they can also come back to us in ways that show that self-similarity that can scale up and take us to higher levels. Attractors. I included here the point, torus, and strange attractors. Point attractors are just one point that makes sense. Torus attractors we see kind of going in a circle, and strange attractors have this kind of strange rhythmicity to that is not always immediately recognized as an attractor. So I put here, how do we examine some of these to discover the influence of these attractors? And we can consider them, here's where we expand out and don't think about this just rationally, but experientially. What is it like to be in a moment where it feels like we're circling the same attractor? We're going around and around. We've probably been in this before. I'm sure many of us have experienced these cycles in our own lives. Some of them can be really positive. The valence here is not necessarily important, but of course it is when we think about it. Some of them can be very positive. The attractor of an important relationship, the attractor of a recognition that a family is growing and developing and changing. Some of them can be more negative, like cycles of abuse, things like that. They can still be attractors, of course, because they're sending us around and around, or they're bringing us back to this kind of common connection, attracting. But they can be positively or negatively valenced. So again, we can have them experientially, affectively. Sometimes they're emotional attractors and we experience them affectively. Sometimes we're experiencing them behaviorally, like consistent patterns in our own lives, whether it's our exercise regimen or it's our diet or it's how we deal with toxins in our own life. Okay, I have three more then too. So the butterfly effect, emergence, and sensitive dependence to initial conditions. Again, then what are the implications for the resilience of spirit that we can take from this? Well, the butterfly effect, again, we can expect that small changes or forces might sometimes create large systemic changes. And again, sometimes these could be positively valenced and sometimes negatively valenced. But if we recognize that there could be big effects from small changes, I think that, to me, is empowering to the spirit. That little butterfly that flapped his wings that Konrad Lorenz wrote about when he was talking about this as a meteorologist and changing the climate on the other side of the planet. The butterfly probably knew not his impact. And in fact, it's metaphoric, but the idea, I think, is profound. And I think that profound idea takes us to places in our own lives where we recognize that small things that we do can have big impacts. So it's recognizing that small things are worth doing. And even if they don't have huge impacts in our initial rendering of them, that we have something that might be there worth looking at in the future. They grow in ways that we might not ever know. And then we finally have emergence. And emergence, again, we've seen this before. Emergence is this idea that we can, again, see these these emergent elements coming out of systems. So here I put attempt to apprehend the self and the contextual influences at a level above the individual components. I know it's wordy, but if you think about yourself as part of something bigger, we can explore then some of these issues that are coming out of us hierarchically, that we're not just one single person. And in fact, that our consciousness might be something that we can see instantiated in others around us. And not just human consciousness, but other levels of consciousness and other energies that we might see in the natural forces and natural entities around us. I said promote higher levels of thinking and ontology. I think especially, we have a tendency, I think, and it certainly was there in the 20th century, to reduce things, to look at these basic elementary units of something. The brain, the neuron, the glial cells, the mitochondria. We're zooming down. But when we zoom up and we promote higher levels of thinking of ontology that go outside of us, I think there's something much deeper to be gained that way too. So it's not at the expense of the other that we promote higher levels of thinking, maybe in ontology, but recognizing that we're climbing ladders as we're also reducing down the basic elements of self. And then I have sensitive dependence to initial conditions. So we assess attitudes, beliefs, contextualize stories to determine dispositional tendencies in self. Many of us here probably keep journals or have maybe at some time in our past. We recognize that stories we tell are important. We recognize that thematically analyzing some of these stories and analyzing our beliefs can take us to places that, again, become hierarchical. They're recognition of dispositional tendencies that don't necessarily bind us, but that might actually free us, because in some ways we're growing from those. So as we look back on the stories that we tell and appreciate the contextualized moments that they were told in, we recognize that there's an opportunity possibly to change, to build, and to use that basic element of story to take us to other places. Okay, so that gives us some direct applications. I think we've reached now the time for the discussion and the philosophical considerations, which I have about 12:45, which is where I wanted to be at this moment. So I have just some thoughts here that I wanted to put up on the screen, but much more so, rather than giving you more content at this point, I would love to have a conversation with you about some of the thoughts that you have related to what I've just shared. So what are your questions about anything that I've shared here, or comments or connections?
Jason, there are two questions from us, from two students that came directly to you.
Okay, are they in the chat there?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, I see, I'm a student. How do I spirituality get rid of the four elements in myself that make me fail in my classes? Another question from, okay, so let me see if I have this one right. How do I use spirituality maybe to get rid of those elements in yourself that make you fail in your classes? Yeah, so if I have the question understood right, and it might be in the way that it was shared there, what I'm trying to promote here and what I've said is that I think that the outcome of feeling spiritually deflated, or feeling like we're disconnected from others, or feeling like we're not seeing this big, broader entity of ourselves in the context around us, can have those effects of lowering our motivation, of lowering our feeling of belonging, of lowering our sense of that telos, that thing that we're striving for. So I think in reorganizing our thoughts around what it is that we're trying to accomplish, and using those kind of bigger picture understandings to promote the time that we're in, I think that might be helpful. And I know that sounds like a lot of words, but when we don't have that spiritual balloon inflated well, I think we find ourselves suffering. And that might seem, the most basic thing to say, but it's not always clear how we inflate the balloon. But what I think is, by using some of these terms, by understanding the horizon a little bit better, we might be able to see ways of helping to inflate that balloon so that we feel like we're connecting in our classes rather than failing, or at least striving to connect in our classes in ways that are meaningful. I had another question here. How about if the butterfly effect is negative? Yeah, so again, we recognize here that both the positive and negatively valenced elements of any of these of any of these occurrences. Small things can have huge impacts, and they can be very, very traumatic. And recognizing that trauma is something that we have to face in our own lives, and recognizing that there's ways to address that trauma, especially as it recurs, affectively, behaviorally, cognitively in our future. Sometimes that means working with a counselor, working with a psychologist, talking with somebody about ways to systematically overcome this. It is unfortunate that many of these things can be negative and they can have long-ranging effects. But getting on top of that and using the services that are around us, I think, can be very, very helpful. And we have a good emerging body of literature there that is helping us all to stay trauma-informed, down to our school systems and up to just our regular organizations and communities. Okay, let's see. Did I see anything else here that came through? I'm just kind of reading as I'm talking. Okay, good. Connecting to the line in the sand. Excellent. Yeah, tabs and Telos and Teleki. Seeds are planted all the time. Yes, emergence of coming and going in a season and out of season. Yeah, I like that, Bertha. And you're absolutely right. There's something to seasons and changes and recognizing the flows of these systems. And I think many of us are buoyed by that and are levied by those times when we see the world change around us. In fact, the positive psychology literature often speaks to the point that we really don't know how resilient we are until we experience some sort of dismantling of the comfort zone that has been created around us. When we're in the plane, it's hard to know how far our parachute might carry us. But when we have to use that parachute and recognize that we have to change the situation that we're in, some of us are actually amazingly, I think, inspired by how far that parachute can carry us. And I know I've tried to use these kind of big, picture ideas of flying far and soaring far. And I don't say that at the expense of recognizing that some of us will falter, and faltering too, I think, has its own opportunities for learning something new. We're compassionate towards self. We take care of ourselves. We forgive ourselves. We recognize that there's times when we didn't accomplish it in the way that we wanted to, but we keep that inner voice inside of us, hopefully moving us in ways that are supportive and are taking us places that we're still yet to go.
And I think it's the idea of freedom of oneself, the idea of change as it emerges day to day, and just having that outlook of hope and strength and resiliency at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, and again, it's that recognition that we're part of something bigger. I think helps us, at least to me, that end of the day kind of stuff, where we're reflecting on what we've done and what we haven't done, and promoting what we're yet to do. I see some other questions here too, from Jennifer. How can we promote these theories to younger generations at the system level in the schools as a tool to help them strive? Yeah, it's interesting. I had a presentation at Lancaster Learns last spring that kind of talked more about the systemic ways that especially school counselors can seek to, make these systemic connections within the schools. I think it's a big opportunity for growth personally, because our school systems, we often do look at as kind of reductionistic. They're, set up in certain ways, and, there's certain rules, but appreciation for what can grow out of those, I think, by allowing maybe a little more freedom, allowing, some of these emergent qualities to take shape, I think can, at least to me, I think can be really beneficial. So seeing the ecological environment as a broader ecology rather than, just what we have to accomplish in the kind of here and now in the moment that we're in. Hopefully that helps. Jennifer, do you have any thoughts about that too, as a follow-up? I know folks are typing in here, and that's okay. If you want to just type, it's fine. And Savannah asked, what advice would you give to someone who wants to be more spiritual but doesn't have spiritual people around them to encourage them to become more spiritual? Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think it's a challenge, at least to me. I'm going to try not to give advice, but I'm going to try to use some of what I know about the human condition to answer that in a broader way. But I think I think our world, I hear these words like, these phrases like toxic people and toxic masculinity and toxic femininity. And they're kind of troubling to me, because I think that by using those words, we are necessarily in an important way highlighting something that's happening that we, I think, all need to be attentive to in some ways. But it seems like in a dismissive way, it seems to put that person out in a way that, to me, I think compassion and empathy and sensitivity might actually bring them in rather than pushing them out. And maybe that's just, the part of me that's always hopeful and looking towards what we can be rather than what we are. Again, I think we're all growing in ways, and we've all experienced, I think, if we're honest with ourselves, toxic moments and, times when we just haven't been the self that we wanted to be, and times that we've, not been the one that could float into the social situation and be the most spirited, and that's okay. Again, that's where we forgive and we use those elements of compassion and empathy on self, because I think it's important to do that to ourselves too. So hopefully we find in others then that spiritual element, because we spread it. And one of the neat parts about using these kind of systems level theories is that we recognize it's not a zero-sum game. We don't take somebody else's spirituality when we give some of ours, or vice versa. We can generate it, and that's where the emergence and the self-renewal and the autopoiesis and the elements of growth that come out of these systems, to me, is very inspiring. So maybe that's helpful in some ways.
Wouldn't it start with self? Isn't what you just presented just begins with you as an individual, and looking at just the elements of that you have presented, of just the seeds being planted and just growing, and growing roots and having roots, in this environment? Doesn't it all start with self?
Yeah, it might. You might be right on there, Bertha. I think there is something to, the self piece of this. And I think you're right. Hopefully we're all striving to be better versions of ourselves. And then again, it's that supportive piece that I think is really important, because that's why I said that piece about, hearing some of those phrases that seem dismissive. And I hear toxic, words like that. And I think, well, what about the person who has just been called toxic, right? Like, what do they do? Because now they've just been identified as this pariah who doesn't belong anywhere. And it's these very elements of these theories, I think, that we need to apply most in those times of suffering. At least to me. And I know it's hard to do, because, some suffering is really, really tough for the people that are around the person who is suffering. But it does come back to self and understanding how we can best support our own selves, and then promote the best self that we can be, I think, in the environments where we find ourselves. Yeah, thanks for saying that, Bertha. I think you're absolutely right. Any other last thoughts? I know we're running out of time here, and I've said a lot of words, but anything else that you want to share? Yeah, Jennifer, thanks. So your school psychology program, yeah, you're absolutely right. How we take these ideas into the school, and I would love to talk with you more about that too, because again, to me, that's how we kind of promote this. And I love the idea that school counselors and school psychologists can be in a position to really affect the microcosm of their school system, even if it doesn't transform the universe yet. It starts small, and that's kind of what we're talking about here, because the things that come out of our schoolhouses will, fly off in directions that just go above and beyond. So hopefully there's some inspiration in that.
Well, Dr. Baker, we certainly thank you so much for this wonderful session that you've given to us on resilience. And we've learned a lot and had some great discussion. Thank you for the gifts of your time and your wisdom today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Our pleasure. We'd just like to remind everyone of our next session, which is on April 22nd, again at 12 p.m. And the session is entitled COVID-19 and Mental Health, Strategies for Success and Wellness. And this will feature Dr. Sarah Gatamu, who's an MD and a master's in public health. She's a psychiatrist with Meadows Psychiatric Center in Pennsylvania. So we do hope that everyone will come back and bring a friend and join us. Thanks to Dr. Margaret Mabinyo, who does all of the organizing for these sessions and has made all of them possible. So thanks to everyone. And I see Dr. Mabinyo has put in the chat the next session. So thanks to everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you on April 22. Take care.